Right now, I am reading this very fascinating book. It is called Death in Florence by Paul Strathern. It's a very accessible book, easy to read, and it's interesting. It keeps you interested as you're reading it. It gives you dates and events, and it gives you descriptions of very chaotic and politically unstable moments in Renaissance history in Italy. And the book talks about this civil war that took place in a city called Ferrara. And basically, what happened was that the ruler of Ferrara, his name was Duke Borso d'Este, died. The d'Este family was extremely powerful. They were second to the Medicis when it came to power and wealth. They were throughout Europe. In fact, they even produced a German king. They produced rulers in regions of Germany like Bavaria. This was a very powerful family. And so the ruler of Ferrara, Duke Borso d'Este, he died in 1471. He became mortally ill in this year. And as he was lying on his deathbed, a civil war broke out in his city of Ferrara. And what happened was his younger brother, Ercole, fought with his cousin Niccolo. So Ercole and Niccolo were fighting each other in a civil war. And you had a faction that was pro Ercole, and you had a faction that was pro Niccolo. And the factions were absolutely sadistic, evil, and sinister. Just sinister, like Lebanese civil war level violence. So it says here that the partisans, intoxicated by the fumes of blood, fought a veritable war of extermination. The wives and daughters of the leaders of the opposing factions were dragged from their homes to be publicly dishonored by the lowest plebs. So they would take the women from their homes, throw them to the mobs, and the mobs would gang rape them in the middle of the street. Like, this was savage. And you read this stuff and you think, oh, in those days it was Christian, right? Like, everybody was Christian. It was more traditional. There were some very sinister people in those days. There were some very cruel people in those days. And it was a very politically unstable time. Italy was full of instability, and it kind of still is an unstable environment. I mean, the economy has a lot of difficulty there, and politically, it's not always very consistent. And you never know. It's like Italy, to me, is a ticking time bomb. You never know when they're going to elect the next Mussolini. But this is the type of savagery that was happening in Ferrara in the late 15th century. So it says that the wives and daughters of the leaders of the opposing factions were dragged from their homes to be publicly dishonored by the lowest plebs. People were pitched from the roofs of their houses where they had fled for refuge to be hacked to pieces in the streets below. Dwellings were set on fire, and the inhabitants, prevented from coming out by their belligerers, perished in the smoke and flames. So they would lock people in their homes and they would light the house on fire. Kind of like what happened in the massacre of Odessa in Ukraine back in 2014. They took a bunch of pro-Russian counter-Maidan protesters and locked them up in a trade union building and lit the whole building on fire. And people who tried to escape were shot at, and dozens of people were slaughtered in the flames. They were killed in the flames. And so this was the type of violence that was happening in Italy at this time. Not too surprising, because Italy, like many other European nations, was a country, or was a region that was filled with war, because Italy, as we know it today, did not exist in those days. Italy did not become really a unified country until sometime within the 19th century. And so this was the environment that Girolamo Savonarola lived in, because the book that I'm reading right now is on the life of Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was a monk who confronted and exposed the evils that were happening in Italy, specifically in the elite circles and in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, in the church hierarchy. And he talked about how Italy was a land where people thirsted for blood, where people thirsted for thievery. And for example, he wrote a number of poems, and there was one poem that he wrote called On the Ruin of the World. And it said, quote, "Now those who live from theft are all content, and those who feed the most on others' blood." Remember, Savonarola lived in Ferrara. That's where he was from. And in the violence, people were literally being nailed onto walls. The book says, the mob supporting Ercola eventually prevailed, yet according to one source, the aftermath was almost as bad. Calefini reports that the bodies of 200 of the leading citizens, after being stripped and mutilated, were nailed to the eaves of the ducal palace. And Savonarola did not live that far away from where this was happening. He lived actually quite close to where this violence was occurring. And it's very likely that he himself had seen this type of violence. And so when he writes about those who feed on others' blood, he was talking, I think he was writing from experience. He was writing in reference to this sort of horror that was transpiring in his native city. And the book goes on to say that Savonarola goes on to rail against those who mock our Lord in heaven, and how Rome is so filled with vice that it can never return to the days of its great past, and how usury is now called philosophy. And here's another interesting line from his poetry. It says, "The scepter has fallen into the hands of a pirate. St. Peter is overthrown. Here lust and greed are everywhere." But Savonarola was a very interesting character. Very interesting character. His grandfather was very wealthy. His grandfather was a doctor who wrote a book on medical science. He studied the human body. He studied anatomy. And he also wrote about child rearing, taking care of children. So he made a lot of money from his knowledge on medical science and on raising children. When Savonarola's grandfather died, his father inherited that money. And the problem was that his father became a money loaner. He began to loan money to people. And the problem was that a lot of the people that he loaned money to defaulted on their loans and weren't paying him back. So he ended up becoming broke to a great extent. So he pushed his son, Girolamo Savonarola, to go into the medical field so that he could become wealthy like his grandfather and could provide for the rest of his family, his father, his mom, etc. Savonarola would go into university where he would study theology, philosophy. And the reason why he had to study these things was because it was a prerequisite to getting into medical school. And so he went to university. He was studying philosophy. He was studying Aristotle, Aquinas, all these things. Humanism. He was very much into humanism. And he got into the musical culture of the time. He learned how to play the lute, which was like a guitar or like a Middle Eastern oud. And he fell in love with the girl next door, literally. He fell in love with the woman who lived in the house next door to his family's home. And he would open up the window and he would serenade her with music and he would play from the lute and she would open up the window and listen to him. And so he was quite confident that he had won this woman's heart, and he confessed his love to her, and she rejected him. And this would be the last woman that he would ever pursue. So he pursued philosophy and intellectual subjects. And in those days, they had, these big festivals in the cities. Think the Count of Monte Cristo type partying. So he went to this big festival, and there was dancing, and there was drinking, and he witnessed sin. He witnessed the sin of the city. And so he entered a church. He left the festival, and he entered a church which was in the middle of Mass, and the priest was reading from the Bible, and the verse of that Mass was where God tells Abraham to leave his father's house and to leave Mesopotamia. And so Savonarola saw this as a sign from God, as a message from God, to leave his family's home and to pursue a spiritual life. And so Savonarola was planning on running away from home. He didn't want to do it immediately because he didn't want to shock his family. So he waited about a year. And then one day his parents went off to church and he decided to run away from home. He packed whatever things he had and he left. And he went into the monastic life. And he would later send a letter to his parents explaining to them everything. And his father was very upset for obvious reasons because he wanted his son to go to medical school so that he could make lots of money. He didn't like the idea of his son going into the monastic life. And Savonarola would later explain why he joined the monastery. And it says here that he joined because of the great wretchedness of the world, the evil of men, rapes, adulteries. It's very interesting that he specifies rapes because he lived in Ferrara. He knew about this horrific violence that was happening where women were being raped in the streets. So he talks about the evils of Italy, violence and rapes and adulteries. And he wrote, "I did this because of the blind wickedness of the people of Italy." So this is why he joined the priesthood. Not the priesthood, but this is why he joined the monastic life. It was to confront the evils of Italy and the evils that were within the church that plagued the church. And so even in those days, the church was full of evil. And today, I wonder how Savonarola would react to the evils of the Vatican currently. If it was that bad in his days, imagine how he would be if he lived in our own time. And the Vatican would the Vatican would absolutely hate Savonarola today. Anyway, those are my thoughts on what I've been reading. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.